Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the third great exponent of the social contract, was the French philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was by birth a Swiss, but adopted France as his country. He lived in the pre-revolutionary 18th century of France, then ruled by the absolutist Bourbon Kings. Rousseau's writings inspired the Great French Revolution of 1789. He presented his theory in two books, namely, a Discoui-se on the origin of inequality and the social contract. Rousseau on the state of nature. Rousseau's views on the state of nature are found in his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Like Locke, Rousseau believed that man lived a free, happy and peaceful life in the state of nature. It was an ideal condition. But two things put an end to this happy existence. One of them was the growth of population, and the other was the origin of private property, which divided men because they began to think in terms mine and thine. With these development, peace, equality and freedom of the state of nature were gone, and in their place war, murder, disputes and quarrels broke out among men. They, however, escaped from this miserable existence only by entering into contract and instituting a civil society. The Contract. In his second and more famous book, Social Contract, Rousseau does not concern himself with the question of the state of nature. He begins his book, Social Contract, with these memorable words: "Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains." It means that man lived free in the earlier natural state but is now everywhere bound by the laws and customs of civilized life. The problem is how to justify the obedience of these laws. Its solution lies in substituting natural freedom by civil freedom. The problem is solved by the social contract. The contract which created the civil society or state is, according to Rousseau, as thus founded: each of us puts into a single mass his person and all his power under the supreme direction of the general will, and we receive as a body each member as an indivisible part of the whole. As in Hobbes's theory, so in Rousseau's the individual surrenders his all, but, unlike Hobbes, he surrenders not to a single person or body of persons but to the whole community. Rousseau's contract, like that of Locke, makes not one person but the whole community sovereign. Rousseau's doctrine of general will and popular sovereignty. The individuals surrendered completely and unconditionally their natural freedom and powers to the community as a whole, which became, thereby, the sovereign body. The body so created is a moral and collective body, because it is under the general will, that is, the will of the whole community. The general will is sovereign. It is sovereign because, firstly, it is created by the free act of those who entered into the contract and have surrendered their individual wills and interests to the supreme direction of the general will, and, secondly, because it is the general will always aims at the common good and it can never err. It is supreme over all individual interests. According to Rousseau, the individuals have surrendered all their rights and have surrendered them not to one person but to the whole community. This complete and unconditional surrender ensures the equality and liberty of all, and also of the life and property of each individual. He goes on to say that no individual can justifiably disobey the general will. By obeying the general will, the individual really obeys himself, because he has created it. When he disobeys the law which is the expression of the general will, he really disobeys himself, and when he is punished for it, he has himself ordered his punishment. Real coercion is not possible in society. When a criminal is punished, he has willed it himself. Coercion is only another aspect of freedom. Rousseau expresses it thus: in order then, that the social contract may not be an empty formula, it includes the undertaking that whoever refuses to obey the general will, shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. Thus Rousseau declares that by obeying the sovereign unconditionally and unquestioningly, the individual becomes really free. The general will is always right. Rousseau emphasizes that, what is not right is not the general will. In this way he subordinated the individual to the state. Influence of Rousseau's theory. Rousseau exercised great influence on political thought and events, especially of France, Germany and America. Rousseau's revolutionary philosophy proclaimed, firstly, that all men are by nature free and equal; secondly, that the authority of government is based on a contract freely entered into by the equal and independent individuals; and, thirdly, that the people are the sovereign. This philosophy inspired the French revolutionaries, who embodied it in the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789, and also influenced the American framers of the Declaration of Independence 1776. Furthermore, Rousseau was an admirer of direct democracy of the ancient Greek type. He emphasized that the people alone should be the law-makers. We find his influence in the adoption of the methods of direct legislation by the people, e.g., the referendum and the initiative in such countries as Switzerland, etc. Popular sovereignty, the idea of consent, and direct legislation by the people were revolutionary teachings in the days of the absolute kings, and led to the French Revolution of 1789. Criticism of Rousseau's social contract theory. Merits of this theory. Rousseau distinguished clearly between the state and the government. He expounded a theory of popular sovereignty. He is the father of modern democracy. He tries to reconcile the absolute authority of the state with the absolute freedom of the individual. He demonstrated one great political truth, that the authority of the government is finally based on the consent of the governed and that force will not be the basis of the state. Defects of theory. Rousseau's philosophy also contains certain defects and paradoxes. He makes no distinction between the state and society, a defect which is found in all idealistic thinking. His main defect, however, lies in his explanation of the general will. He has endowed it with absolute powers. But he failed to see that the unrestricted power of the general will might prove to be as arbitrary and tyrannical to certain individuals and sections of the people as was the absolute power of the kings. There is no guarantee that the general will is absolutely disinterested and impartial among the conflicting wills of all the individuals. Rousseau asserts that the general will is neither the will of all nor the will of the majority. Theoretically it is correct, but in practice the general will is expressed as the will of the majority, and not as the will of all. Lastly, by subordinating the individual will completely to the general will, Rousseau subordinated the individual to the unrestricted authority of the state. He thus paved the way for the authoritarian or totalitarian states of present times.